Welcome to this special Lesley Riddoch podcast, which is actually picking up on a really interesting event at the Independence Forum that was held in Perth at the start of June. And there was a session there that was looking at culture. It was absolutely fascinating, and I wish it had been recorded. It wasn't. So here we are with the two protagonists of that event, Stuart McHardy and Roger Emmerson. I'm just going to introduce them a wee bit, but say hello, guys, so we prove that we've got other living people in this.
Hello.
Hi there.
Right, the deadpan voice is Roger. Stuart is the kind of cheerier guy. That's a wee warning, Roger. Stuart is a writer described as occasional broadcaster, storyteller. He's been active in Scottish culture throughout his life, music, poetry, language, folklore. And he's been director of the Scots Language Resource Centre in Perth, president of the Pictish Art Society. He's got loads of books, The Quest for Arthur, The Quest for the Nine Maidens, and a really brilliant one, Tales of Whiskey and Smuggling, The Wild Haggis and the Green-Faced Nyaff. So you can get from that he switches between Scots and, well, actually he doesn't really, just speak Scots. Roger Emmerson has worked in London, Newcastle on Tyne, mostly Edinburgh, running his own practice, Archimedia, from 1987 to 99, while he was also teaching architectural design at Edinburgh College of Art, also visiting lecture at universities in Venice, Lisbon, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Berkeley. So he's worked a lot in architectural conservation, and he's written a book, The Land of Stone, A Journey Through Modern Architecture in Scotland, What I Have in My Hands Here. So if we can start off, Stuart, as I think we did, in the actual event, one thing that you said that I retweeted got a fair amount of traction, which was the struggle to get Scottish history taught in schools. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that over the years has constantly caused absolute amazement in visitors from the continent in particular is to find out that for all of the 20th century, there was no stated requirement to teach Scottish history to Scottish children. It wasn't a part of the curriculum, and that those who were lucky enough to get some, and I had a fabulous history teacher from secondary school, that we were very lucky. It was not a requirement. And in fact, I would say the truth of the matter is that there was not just a reluctance, but a virtual refusal to deal with the reality that people in Scotland didn't get to know their own history, because so much of it has been distorted, suppressed, and I would say perverted over the years. And the situation has improved over the past 15 years, but it's got a long way to go yet.
But when did it become, the curriculum for excellence kicked in, and with it then that, 2009 was something you mentioned as a kind of date where things really shifted.
Yeah, that was the curriculum for excellence coming in, and it stipulates that parents have to get Scots history and also Scots language as part of their education. And only 20 years, less than 20 years before then, would fail to actually get Scots language and history into the curriculum, because there was a large meeting in the late 90s, so it's only 10 years earlier, that virtually every professional in Scotland agreed that we should put both these topics into the curriculum for parents. And basically the then Scottish Consultative Council on the Curriculum, which is a difficult phrase, they actually refused to even publish a report that called for it, because there was this fear of teaching Scottish history.
Right. What's the fear? I can guess, but what do you think the fear's about?
I think the fear is quite simply, and I think it was illustrated quite well with the wee documentary that we got up on YouTube, The Occupation, that it's only come out in the past 15 years that there was a British Army occupation of virtually the whole of Scotland for 10 years after Culloden. Now that's into modern times, but a blanket occupation of Scotland for 10 years because the government knew that the people in Scotland were ready to rise again. And that has been completely eradicated from Scottish history. And instead what we get is the Walter Scott version, which is basically, the doomed romantic Highlander, trying to turn the clock back. That kind of utter bloody nonsense that we've been given. And it was a fear that people in Scotland, if they realised their own history, would basically ensure that the Union was on even shakier ground.
There's a parallel there, Stu. One of the things that struck me when researching the second book was I had a look at the planned communities that were built throughout Scotland from about 1760 onward. Some of them being planned earlier, but the building started about 1760. Places like Thurso, Pulteney Town in Wick, Inveraray, where they were built with very broad streets, broad enough literally to walk a march, a regiment down. And the towns themselves were set up very symbolically, so that in Thurso you have Barrack Street with the army barracks at the head of it. In Inveraray you have the head of the town, which is the church, but on one side is the city hall, our town hall, and the other side is the jail. So that within the built environment, never mind anything else, structures are being made to facilitate military movement, but also to establish a system of rule and to very much externalize that in actual physical embodiment in buildings and in structure.
Roger, can I just leap in a second? Because as a woman whose family come from Pulteney Town in Wick, that is, I hadn't quite got my head around that. Ullapool would be another one, I think. Nice broad streets and everything. Those planned communities, apart from that possible utility for kind of marching troops along, it was also in some places a sort of townification or villagification of what had previously been a different kind of land settlement pattern. And after the clearances, clearly, people were forced into towns, villages, etc., which now we take as normal, but actually is pretty weird if you look across the rest of Europe.
I mean, you might even characterise them as reservations of one sort, if you wanted to make a parallel, let us say, with what happened to the native peoples of America, for instance. I mean, they were forced into settlements which did not occur or concur with their way of life. Yeah, I mean, there's a broad range of things that and again, this is one of the problems from my discipline coming from, that these are seen as advantageous architectural events, but they're advantageous only to a very small section of the population. And regrettably, of course, that's the section that writes the histories or prevents the histories being made apparent. But yeah, there are any number of reasons why you would do these things, and they're certainly at the core of them is certainly controlling the population one way or another.
Well, it's this notion of the age of improvement.
Yeah.
If you look at the maps that were drawn up in the 1740s by General Roy, this is the origin of the Ordnance Survey, which gives the game away. Where do you point your cannons?
That's right. How far is it to shoot?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you look at the whole of Scotland, it's not just the Highlands, it's the whole of the Lowlands as well, outside of very limited areas. The occupation pattern is small, what we call fern-tunes in the Lowlands and ballias in the Highlands. And these are effectively small, essentially self-sufficient economically. People that are growing their own food, working the land themselves. And the pattern probably goes back to the Bronze Age, if not earlier. And this has got all kinds of cultural ramifications when you begin to understand this. But the truth of the matter is that the clearances starting in the Lowlands as early as 1720, what happens is that the ancient way of life that had survived for millennia, had also been very culturally successful. When you think of Scotland's role in literature in Europe throughout the medieval period, this whole way of life was effectively designated as primitive, savage, and had to be got rid of. And the only reason basically to do that was to fatten the wallets of the lairds.
Roger, just to leap in at this point, because I just wanted to kind of get the sense from Roger, just to backtrack ever so slightly and then just fire away, guys. Roger, on this question that Stuart began with, which was the sort of resistance in a way to exploring any aspect of Scottish history, essentially, or putting it on the curriculum. You encountered a similar sort of resistance when you began to try to teach Scottish architecture.
Yes, it was actually more complicated than that because I learned later it was the first course in Scottish architecture that had been taught in a Scottish school of architecture, and I didn't start it till 1993. The reason I started it was I was running the Erasmus exchanges from Edinburgh to European universities, and I also had a lot of students in from Southeast Asia, and I used the course basically to orientate them in Scotland. This is what we're like. This is how we are. This is what you're looking at. And gradually people drifted in from other years to sit in the lectures. It was not examinable. It was there just as an option. And in the end, the classes were getting so big that the school administration decided that it would make it an examinable subject. But that was not till 1998. And the problem simply was that Scottish architecture, like so many things in Scottish culture, was only ever seen as a footnote. It only had relevance where it did something which either magnified, amplified, or filled a hole in the great narrative that was being produced in Oxbridge. So Charles Rennie Mackintosh satisfies for many a great big hole, which allows British architecture to associate with European architecture at a very significant point of change. So the Art Nouveau movement, if you like, if you can call it a movement, but that moment of change at the début du siècle, you find that Charles Rennie Mackintosh is of international significance. Therefore, he becomes part of the British narrative. And the rest, if it does not fit the British narrative, is disregarded. So that was basically the situation. But I think if I hadn't started it as the kind of course I did, it wouldn't have been there at all. I have no idea whether it's still a course at Edinburgh University, or it may be, it may not be. But
I know that it was a course at Dundee because Charles McKean who sadly died about 5 or 6 years ago, was the professor of Scottish architecture. And I must say, in a lot of the books I wrote, he kindly literally took me around. He used to do walking tours of Dundee, actually, Charles, and had all sorts of punters coming around with him to really try and understand a city that had always, in fact, didn't have a new town, as he pointed out uniquely. And a lot of the character of Dundee sprung from its medieval sort of mixter-maxter kind of nature, slightly mashed over more recently since the 60s. But I mean, he was absolutely fascinating and mind-opening on so many aspects. For example, I think he had a big thing that the Scots had been set up as endlessly warring, so that a lot of the architectural construction was interpreted as castellation to protect yourself against the other BAMs from the next neighbourhood, which he actually reinterpreted in very different ways and drew a lot of parallels. I'm probably mixing all sorts of stuff up here, Roger, but with a lot of the sort of French chateau type, you're at the centre of your domain kind of setups.
Charles McKean's problematic, for me at any rate. I knew him very well in the 80s, and I actually designed his house extension at Hill Park in Edinburgh. Charles's problem, or his problem for me and for others like me, is that his approach, while historic, it evidenced itself ultimately as an aesthetic approach. And my beef with this is that this is what's misleading about a lot of that kind of culture, is that the approach taken is aesthetic, when in fact there are far deeper issues in Scottish culture which link all aspects of Scottish culture, which may result in aesthetic productions, but they are not a priori aesthetic. And the difficulty, I think, with Charles McKean and many who are associated with him, principally the large crew at Historic Environment Scotland, are still approaching Scottish architecture and Scottish culture as a whole, really, from an aesthetic point of view, which leads to a lot of problems for them because it runs on its own juices. And when they're trying to establish status for it in an international sense, it's difficult because it has its own internal logic, which is maybe sometimes fits with the international scene, but mostly doesn't. And there's a lot of straining after French connections, German connections, Dutch connections, Swedish connections, which, from an aesthetic point of view, are temporary and difficult. And that was certainly one of the things I found while trying to do a course on Scottish architecture, which was more to say to people that, look, architecture is only one evidence of a culture. It's not all of it. It's the one that sticks in our face most frequently. We connect with it every day of our lives, but it's only one small aspect of it. And what one needs to do is try and find out what are the sources of that culture and how ultimately do they end up looking the way they do. But you cannot, in my view at any rate, come at them from an aesthetic point of view. It's so tricky.
Okay, now this is totally fascinating. I'm looking at your book here. I'm trying to see how many pages there are. 387. So I'm asking you to say something in relatively short space, Roger, when you've spent a lot of time, in a book making the point. However, what would be those deeper sources then? What would be the characteristics of Scottish culture that then works its way through to the built environment?
Well, I think it's simply that we have this ability to deal with two things at once. We can look at any topic from 180 degrees. We can look at the thesis and the antithesis. We can look at what's for, what's against. And we encapsulate that in our own culture. In colloquialism, everybody says, I'm in twa minds. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they're actually going to make up the mind one way or the other, but what it does mean is we have the ability to deal with a range of ideas across 180 degrees and find a means of dealing with them in an inventive fashion. Now, that doesn't mean to say we're making a compromise, far from it, but it does mean to say that we can actually see things in a very broad sense. Now, that's one. There's another one is a hema doubts, but it doesn't mean to say that you're actually going to respond to what your doubts are. It just means that you have seen the thing in its totality. Now, that interests me because when you look further back and you look back at Celtic culture, one of the very significant things of Celtic culture was this idea of being between one thing and another. And that was encapsulated particularly in the Celtic view of the tree, for instance. The willow sits between the solid ground and the water. And it has significance in that, being in that place between two different environments. The same with the rowan. It's on the hillside, but it's under the sky. It's between the one thing and the other, between the earth, between humankind and the gods. And these are significant things, and these are deep embedded. Whether people consciously are aware of them or not is difficult to say. I picked up a book the other day, published in 1996, which is an anthology of Scottish fantasy by Manlove, and he talks in his introductory essay. He never quite gets to the point, but he actually does talk about this sense of duality, and I think, for me, at any rate, what Land of Stone was about was my search to find out how you express that duality. I've had further thoughts about it since, and there are other issues that certainly now I would want to put in the book, but it was that search for duality. And I think, to a level, I think I found what that duality was and how it expressed itself culturally, particularly in my own sphere of interest, being architecture.
And I know Stuart wants to come in, but one last thing, Roger. I hear you that you don't want to just look at the aesthetics of things, but I wonder if there are things that express that duality or the hey in your doots in the built environment.
Oh, there's plenty. Several of them in the latest book, but I'll give you one, just as a quickie. The work of Sir James Gowans in the 1850s through to the 1880s in Edinburgh, Lammerburn, a house up in Polwarth. He devised this system of making small sizes of stone. He worked on a basis of a 2-foot module, and it was a rational means of constructing a building. Very rational. He was a quarry owner. It also simplified construction and site enormously because it made the stones lighter to put in place rather than huge ashlar blocks. But when you look at the building, what you're presented with is something which is wholly romantic aesthetically, but the essence of it is a rational process. So it's that concept that within one building you can have both. You can have the romantic and you can have the rational.
Okay, Stuart.
Well, what I was actually thinking about there was that the initial approach, which Roger's referred to as being aesthetic, is part of the problem that our institutions have, because they are effectively, their face is set against Scots culture at all levels. And I'm reminded of something that happened quite recently. There's a lad I know, DJ Johnson Smith, who did his PhD a few years back on what he referred to as the clearances in Edinburgh. He coined the lovely term domicide. This was when the university in the 60s and 70s basically gutted the whole area around the university, driving out thousands and thousands of people, knocking down absolutely perfectly sound buildings, some of which went back nearly half a millennium. And one of the big problems he had when he presented his notion of doing his PhD on this was that there was a real resistance amongst the people he was dealing with at the university to the fact that he called it clearance, because that was theirs. The idea that they had of clearance was something that they could talk about in the Highlands, because our history and our culture has been so programmed and so packaged and so twisted to fit in with an essentially romantic view that we've inherited from Scott and his pals, that fits very, very well with the dominant British Empire mentality of our institutions, but has got very little indeed to do with who we actually are.
I think you're right, Sue. I remember the time well. We had a house, a flat in the south side at the time the university was doing, subject to planning blight. We got it incredibly cheap. I took a risk, which paid off in the end. But it was, for a while, you'll remember it too, we were there at the same time, that kind of sense that someone could run roughshod over a community for self-aggrandizement. The projects that were being proposed, the nature of the road that was to carve through it all, staggeringly awful. And the problem with that, of course, was the road was ostensibly there in order to facilitate traffic into the city. But what the traffic into the city was not doing was supplying additional workers. There was no intention to increase employment within the city. It was just merely to facilitate those who were arriving already. Any new employment was directed elsewhere. I had a thought about this, and I need to do some research on it. But my belief is that all the major Scottish cities were held back. They were not allowed to increase their population. And in fact, as we know in Glasgow, population was actively scythed by Margaret Thatcher by the removal of Bearsden and others in order to control it. And my belief is the Scottish cities have certainly been controlled by controlling population growth. We should be very careful about dispersal programs, and certainly that one, the clearances on the south side of Edinburgh, was significant.
Can I raise another incident from history, which was actually when I mentioned that we were going to do this podcast, Fraser Darling, who's a listener, got in touch and wanted me to pass this on from his dad, Ken, who is very keen on history, about another sort of bit of history that somehow got completely neglected, Stuart, which was the winter of 1651, Oliver Cromwell's invasion of Scotland to seize something in Edinburgh Castle more precious than gold, the national records of Scotland. Just tell us about this saga.
Well, what is extremely interesting about this is it's a repeat saga. This had happened before. When Langshanks came up in 1296, he pillaged the monasteries, which were then the repositories of all documentation, and ran off with everything. His reasoning was basically that all Scotland's ancient documents showed that Scotland was an older country than England, which he couldn't stand, and also emphasised well-established sovereignty. And I think Cromwell was doing the same kind of thing, because Cromwell actually, during his short 10 years, he actually annexed Scotland. Scotland was just made part of Britain during Cromwell's time. And his seizing of the documents, I think, was part of the process of denying future generations the possibility of using the law as arguments against basic imperialism. The problem was that even after he went, and I think the guy that got in touch with you told you about this, that the documents after Charles II comes back in, the documents are supposed to be sent back up, but strangely, as had happened at the Treaty of Northampton, after the Treaty of Northampton in 1328, the ship bearing the documents foundered somewhere off the east coast of England. It happened twice. And the whole thrust of this has been to remove documentation that basically emphasises that Scotland is a nation in itself. And this is why we didn't hear about it.
It's fascinating, really, because this actually Ken Darling goes on to say that that same thing happened with royal documents which were seized from Delhi in the 1857 uprising there. A steamer named Erin was lost in the Indian Ocean whilst transporting those sensitive state papers. As with the Scottish example, the loss was accepted without investigation. The records were never recovered.
But it's also part of something larger, because it's only in the past couple of years that access to the Stuart papers has been possible in Scotland. The actual papers of the Stuarts were kept in London. They also, if you were lucky enough to be in Melbourne, you could get them there. You could get them in Chicago. They were sent out, copies of them were sent out to various places around the old empire, but none of them ever came back up here. Because the control of history, as has been shown time and time again, is a political tool for those who wish to dominate. And basically, if you want to have an empire, you either destroy or steal the history of those that you're out to conquer. It's part of the game plan of empire. And I'm afraid to say that the truth of the matter is that Scottish institutions have been complicit in this since 1603.
Yeah, professionals don't come out very well from either of you guys, actually, the current rake of professionals, because they seem to be presiding. Well, like actually also I think my own perception of this is a tremendous mistrust of the ordinary person, and a huge kind of class issue begins to feed its way into all of this.
Yeah,
But
well, I mean,
still,
it's the privilege that emanates from the constitutional monarchy. I mean, people see that as the route ahead. I can remember a young architect in the 1970s planning out his career to me, which ended up with a knighthood. Now, I mean, I thought, who in their right mind has that as a conception of a career? But then, of course, very many do. Um, uh, a second cousin of mine changed his name by deed poll to reconnect with a distant branch of the family which has aristocratic connections. I tore him to pieces about it because I was just furious. I said, what's wrong with your own name? Why can't you be who you are? Why do you have to be somebody else? But it's that sense that if you play the imperial game, then you will gain the privilege, and you will gain the access, and you will gain the entitlement. Whereas for the rest of us who are sensibly not interested in that kind of thing, we're judged on our own merits. And I think that is a particularly Scottish view, is to be judged on your own merits, not on the merits of some system. And inevitably it draws everybody into it. The whole business of professional institutes being chartered via the Privy Council, in order to gain some sense that they're okay, they're right, their rules are okay, they'll behave themselves and perform their functions for you in the correct manner, but they're in the whole soup. They're drawn into it. They're all part of that entire nexus. What people like me have been saying for long enough is this is just ridiculous. There are other ways of gaining um, uh, satisfactory status within society, and guarantee of your probity and ability to do your work, that does not require you to join this other imperial monarchical narrative. But I think it's appealing to so many people. And of course, it's perpetuated year in, year out, birthday honours, New Year honours, offerings of peerages by departing prime ministers. I mean, really, the system just reeks.
Stuart, of course, one person who famously turned that down was Hamish Henderson, who very, sorry?
Of course he did.
Yeah, very much embodied the totally opposite view to that, which was the prime importance of folk culture, memory, etc. And that was something that you talked about, was that despite all these attempts, essentially by a professional class that has aspirations towards a sort of British stamp of approval in many cases, the folk memory of many things, including even the Jacobite era, is carried in that sort of the carrying stream, as Hamish would have put it.
Yeah. Well, his basic thesis, he was on about it, was that, and he said he got it from Gramsci, the Italian philosopher. I've looked through Gramsci in Hamish's translations, and I can't find it. I think it was Hamish himself, and he said, "You've got to remember, Stuart, that culture leads politics, never the other way around." And he's absolutely and completely clear in that. And I've been writing about this quite a lot recently. I've been talking a lot about it, and I've even managed to get some of this into some of the classes. I still teach for the outreach department at the university. So I've got one foot in the establishment, Roger. And basically, the whole point of the folk memory, if you think of it more as the ongoing dynamism of the common culture, and recently I've been doing a lot of stuff on this period after Culloden and the suppression and all the rest of it. But one of the things that I've had to change my mind about very, very much is I used to know like the Corries. Personally, doesn't go into it, but because they're always singing songs about these romantic Jacobites. And then it took me years to realise, in actual fact, the reason so many folk in Scotland ken all these Jacobite songs is that on one level, we've never forgotten what happened after Culloden and the ethnic cleansing that was perpetrated by the Duke of Cumberland and his troops. This has never gone away. An awareness of that has never disappeared from the culture. And people, you get the strangest things, very, very staunch Presbyterian people singing Jacobite songs because they, on some level, understand that this is about who they are. It's about their identity and it's about their history. And the survival of this is absolutely amazing because if you like, the official history is basically they overcame this very handsome, talented, doomed young prince who led the remnants of a dying culture into their final tragic act. And it's complete and utter bollocks that what happened, what we've been given. But on
you mean the culture survived? It survived being proscribed, banned, the full 9 yards.
Despite all this, and it's not just there. I'll give you another example here. In the mid-1980s, you could not find a book in print on the Picts, right? The reason that changed was that a bunch of enthusiasts got together with very, very, very tenuous links to any of the educational institutions. But a bunch of people just got together and decided to do something about it and formed a society. I was there. And nowadays, if you go into any Scottish bookshop, you can go into bookshops in Piccadilly and you will find not just one, but several books on the Picts. But they were ignored because they were part of Scottish culture, and Scottish culture didn't matter. But once a group of people, as I say, just coming together, a bunch of enthusiasts, got together, they found the response was amazing. And now it has fed back in, if you like, in that the teaching of matters Pictish at our universities has increased exponentially. There are actually a lot of archaeological excavations been going on over the past 15 years. Back right up to the 80s, none of that would have been possible. It's because the culture has never gone away.
And yet this, I remember, this is making me remember when I was on Radio Scotland a long time ago, David Starkey, sorry to bust it all up here, the English historian, came on to do an interview about a series he had just launched, which was called The Monarchy, I think it was, The Monarchy of England. And I may have got that wrong, but it was looking at monarchy, but it was only about England. I think maybe that was more the point. And I'd sort of said to him, well, why don't you just be honest and call this the Monarchy of England? That was it, because you really haven't tackled anything except the English monarchy system. And his reply then was, just as Roger said at the beginning, that Scotland's only interesting when it does exceptional things. So it has to be an interesting, a side salad before you basically take your eyes off the big steak in the middle of the plate. He said, really, nothing of significance has happened in Scotland in historical terms. And that was commissioned by, maybe it was Channel 4, maybe it was the BBC, but I think it was the BBC, was it not? Who still are doing repeats of Neil Oliver, giving us all sorts. Now, I appreciate being a presenter, very often you're handed a script and you just read what's there. So, that, but still, I mean, Neil, let's just be charitable, has some extremely odd ideas, no matter which way you're coming at it these days, and is pretty much removed from everything, including the presidency or whatever of the National Trust of Scotland. And yet it's still, that's his kind of, he's at the helm of interpreting ancient periods of history and all the way through for the average viewer on the BBC.
Yeah, and he's not fit for it.
And Stuart, I'd imagine, I mean, this must take lumps out of you, because I've known you for a very long time, and kind of you have totally poured your life into trying to And you have, valorising the Scottish language, normalising Scottish history. And yet the establishment would still sort of possibly look askance at you, partly because you speak Scots.
There's no doubt about that. But also, I should make it awfully clear that when I was a youngster, due partly to my father's eccentric political viewpoints, I was raised on what was then considered the roughest scheme in the British Isles, Curtin in Dundee. And I was considered extremely posh because my father spoke not quite with a bull in his mouth, but definitely he was what you would call Anglophone Scots, very precise speaking. My mother, who went on to become a teacher in her early 40s, was a bit the same. My brother, all his days, was quite middle-class Scottish spoken. My sister, who lives in England, is very much like that. I made a deliberate choice because I wasn't happy with it. My granny spoke Scots, my granddad, and everybody around me spoke Scots, but I made a deliberate choice about the way I spoke because I felt better. And also, it was, the whole notion of accepting that one language is better than another and has more virtue and all the rest of it. It's quite honestly, it's intellectually and psychologically insane.
But it's very widespread, Stu. I mean, this idea of the famous English clothier, they can't deal with phonemes which are not English. I remember I've spent a lot of time in Czechia. I don't speak it. I speak enough to get by. But I was there with colleagues from universities in the south, and their struggle to master any basic bit of, even just to say where they were. They gave up at first course. And I think that, again, is one of the reasons why they struggle, particularly with Scottish. They think it's couthy, they think it's pocky, simply because their ear tells them nothing beyond the sounds of English as spoken in England. And I think that's a phenomenal difficulty. Reverting very quickly, if I may, to the beloved Starkey and Oliver, I think what's interesting about them, and the way you've both talked about them, is intriguing because it says to me, and it's what I feel, is that they've backed themselves into such corners that they're seen as comic characters. And we need to look at these things and just say, well, there is a resurgence here, and the resurgence is such that we're not going to sit in a room and be hectored by either of them or any of their colleagues, simply because we don't believe it anymore. And we don't feel oppressed or denigrated or made to feel less because of what they're saying, simply because they're speaking ex cathedra, as it were, from the BBC, that there is another story and that people are connecting with another story. I've been intrigued at the number of offers to speak from fairly dyed-in-the-wool organisations here. I've been asked to speak at the National Galleries. I've been asked to speak to the Old Edinburgh Club. I've been asked to speak to the Salthouse Society. I've been asked to speak to the Architectural Heritage Society of Scotland. Now, these to me are part of the establishment, but there is an interest. There's a sense of something stirring that the old stories are the wrong stories, and there are other stories which needs to be excavated, and that I find fascinating. I have contacts in India, and the same is happening in India, is irrespective of what you might think of their global political connections, but within India itself, their resurrection of their own culture, their understanding of what they were capable of, and their understanding of how many of the things we ascribe to Western ingenuity had either been attempted in India parallel or had actually originated in India. And it's just intriguing to look around the world that so many cultures are suddenly beginning to look at themselves again, um, and that the old imperial cloak has been dragged off, and something else is exposed underneath, which is far more vibrant, far more interesting, far more connecting. The blanket of the imperial regime is such that it flattens everything out to make it acceptable and easy, obviously, for the rulers to rule. But underneath it all, there is this incredible other. And I'm certainly very encouraged at the moment when I speak to people. I can speak to people in a way that I couldn't in the 1990s about being Scottish. I didn't give up speaking about being Scottish, but I knew people thought I was an oddity, that there was a larger thing that was afoot. The problem, of course, again, is that the assumption being made is that if you focus on Scotland, that somehow you've forgotten the wider world. Absolutely not. We only see ourselves in relation to the wider world. What we want to throw off is the fact that we've been obliged to see ourselves in relation to one single other country. And that's the difference. So I certainly feel that, there's something in the air. I feel there's something in the air. But the sooner our political leaders begin to grasp what Stu said, which was politics follow culture, they need to grasp and connect with culture. It's not simply enough to play a political game. You need to have some basis for that. Otherwise, you can be challenged so easily, and your failings are made so abundantly clear because you've got no basis for them at all, other than a notion you're doing it because somebody else is not. But certainly, I get that feeling, and I think that's why when one looks at Starkey and Oliver, you know what they are. The clowns performing on an ever more constricting stage.
Yeah. Also, though, there's aspects of this. I mean, an awful lot of what I've been advocating for an awful long time is just to be confident.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of thing. But one of the things that recently caused great hilarity down here on the Costa del Forth was Jeremy Clarkson. It's now up on, I believe, on YouTube. And he was lecturing to people. And I don't know what the man thought he was doing, but he had this screen behind him and he said, I'm going to show you all of the inventions that came from Wales. And there was a wee trickle. And then I'm going to show you the ones that come from Ireland. And there was a bigger trickle. And then I'm going to show you the ones that came from England. And there was a slightly bigger trickle. And he said, and here, by the way, are the inventions that were originated by Scots. And there was something like 10 pages. Screen after screen after screen after screen after screen. Now, he was obviously trying to make a point of some kind down there. But the actual reality of what our tiny wee nation has contributed to the world is absolutely amazing. And it's not that the world doesn't know. It's the fact that Scotland doesn't know, because the whole notion of the control of history and the control of culture is to stop us looking at ourselves and stop us understanding our history and stop us understanding who we are, because we are, we're captious. There's no doubt about that. We may be a bit prone to being over-celebratory, but we are one of the great creative nations of humanity. And the notion that we can only function because we're stuck with a rump of the most bloody empire that's ever existed on the planet is actually offensive.
But do you not think, I think sometimes people, in fact, what wounds people, particularly about the current situation where ferry contracts are going off to other countries, we don't seem to be building anything here. I think there's no rolled steel in Scotland anymore. Of course, Thatcher shut Ravenscraig, people can see where that all began to go wrong. However, if the Scottish government hugs to itself the capacity to set Scotland back on its feet, you obviously are not going to go back to the kind of total Clyde glory days. However, having travelled around, neighbouring countries, there's shipbuilding happening in lots and lots of fjords of Norway, and there's a lot more of a kind of built environment. And that kind of the maker kind of ability, I mean, literally making engineers, ideas being made into things, that, if it characterises Scots, seems to have kind of gone out of things. And I think that may be why people feel so wounded and let down when the most basic attempts to construct things seem to fail.
Yeah, but that's a political choice because we have got a political system that is an inheritance from Westminster. And Westminster is irredeemably corrupt and always has been. It exists to defend the interests of English and British oligarchs. That's what it's about. And we're talking earlier about acceptability, and it's like there's this veneer of bourgeois culture that is used to disguise the exploitative nature of the rump of the British Empire. And it's all about being polite and being nice, but it's also about something else that we're never going to get any further until we address. And that is, and I've been having this argument with people in the SNP for roughly 35 years. And they have this notion that once they get into power, their job is to take the best advice possible, to do their best for the electorate. And what this means in practice is that they go and they listen to people who they are prepared to accept as experts, all of whom have been brought up in systems that have been controlled either by the Tories or by Labour and are essentially and irredeemably unionist in their way of thinking. And they go and they listen. And I no longer speak to anybody high up in the SNP. But back in the day when I did ken a lot of them, I would say, your job is to go in there with a vision, with a manifesto, and tell these people that they have to do what you tell them. Not to sit there and ask them, oh, what should we be doing now? Because that's basically what our government does.
It's interesting that you say that, Stu, because I think it's really embedded in Scottish politics. I remember I gave a paper at a conference of the Small Towns Association, Small Boroughs Association, in the 1990s, late 1990s. It was held in Kirriemuir, and it was attended by a large number of town councillors, among others. There were some academics there. But my point was that the problem with the small boroughs, the small towns, is that they are construed historically. So in Kirriemuir, it was gingerbread that was thought to be the big deal. In fact, as you went around Scotland, you realise it was the contents of the baker's oven that seemed to determine what a place thought of itself. Selkirk, Bannocks, Aberdeen, Rowies, you name it. That was it. But what was interesting to me was I thought, I'll do something else because I had a lot of experience of small towns in Denmark. And the revealing things about small towns in Denmark is that some of the most world-famous products come out of places no bigger than Kirriemuir. In fact, smaller than Kirriemuir. Bang & Olufsen, Randers Furniture, you name it. There's just one thing after another. And the problem with this kind of view of Scottish small boroughs, again, is this historic view. So Kirriemuir is actually the base for one of the largest UK distributors of thermal insulation material. Now, it doesn't have the romantic overtones. Expanded polystyrene board or rock wool does not have the same appeal as Kirriemuir gingerbread. But what you have to say is that's the reality of Kirriemuir. And throughout Scotland, the small boroughs are like that. There is a reality which is not the one, regrettably, that they tend to post about themselves, because somehow they cannot link with what a contemporary life is like. It's not about producing interesting things from the baker. It's about producing real products for real use right now. And I think the difficulty for me was in that discussion was that it was so hard to get past these views. It's like Glasgow councillors, you go and speak to them and they talk about the resurgence of the Clyde and you think, you have not got a hope in hell. Those ships have gone to South Korea, they've gone to Helsinki, you're not building them.
But those other countries that also lost, I was astonished when I went to Gothenburg in Sweden, and when they all lost their shipbuilding industries, and I didn't realise Gothenburg at one point was bigger than the Clyde. The Swedish government ponied in new stuff, so Saab and various other, manufacturers, car manufacturers, and when that went south, they started negotiations with Denmark to create the Øresund Bridge, which spans the two countries and has created the most fastest growing economic area down in Skåne in the south of Sweden. So the point is, it's like, there's not just a giving up, but there's an understanding. You need to keep literally building ideas because Øresund, the bridge, is an idea.
You've got to think sideways. You've just got to go sideways because, the direct route to where we were before is not open to us anymore. It's gone. It was interesting that when I was giving that talk, I was talking about Silicon Glen, and you may remember a brief association with electronics that somehow was not unsustainable. But we have to find ways of moving sideways and actually picking up on things that are inherent here and that we can work with and make work for our benefit. But one has to be careful. The world is so competitive. You cannot afford to get into industries where already they're cornered. And that's the difficulty. And these are the things vision things that a Scottish government should have, not trying to revive some bit of the Clyde by throwing the ferry at a company with a slightly odd history. I'll say no more than that. That, you need to be, let that ferry go to Turkey, let that ferry go to South Korea. Doesn't matter. What you need to do is find the things that work for you.
Mm-hmm. Let me finish because we could. I strongly sense we will be back, chaps. It's fascinating, but I just was thinking about your sideways, the requirement for sideways looking at things, Roger, and also what I think you may have said before about the kind of British imperative to be polite and nice in your dealings with things, all of which is delightfully negated by a series that is top of Netflix at the moment, Department Q. Have either of you seen that?
Oh,
yeah, seen it all.
Right. Utterly amazing, actually, because it is withering. So kind of, it's actually written by a Dane, first of all, which is astonishing. Then turned into the screenplay by an American, Scott Frank, who's from California. And you kind of think, if you watch it, especially not trying to ruin the end, but the end is so utterly Scottish, it's kind of gobsmacking, and it's just there's no polite or nice in it. In fact, someone heard an interview with Scott Frank, who I am now going to pursue and see if I can get on for a podcast special. And he said the most frequent question he was asked was, "Do Scots swear that much?"
And the answer is yes, but on something as nice as your podcast, Lesley, I was told by my wife, tone it down.
Yeah.
Or if there's swearies, you have to put a wee tick on the box, and it sort of limits its circulation, so we all kind of keep it together. But But that's another thing as well, because I find a lot of the time when I go around talking, people are very still agitated about the BBC. And this goes back to something Roger was saying just about these figures now being sort of comic bogey figures. The majority, so many people now are not watching even any terrestrial TV. They're watching Netflix and YouTube. And so, something being number one on Netflix, which Department Q is, which presents an entirely different and obviously internationally popular kind of withering Scottishness, but kind of quite, it's totally able to hold many things together at once. That's really quite an achievement that people should be a little bit pleased about.
Well, I think so, but I'm going to get a T-shirt made quite soon, which is simply going to say "Bugger Polly Tess."
Right.
I've got my order in.
Yeah, because basically the whole notion of respectability, which has underpinned far too much of the BBC for a long time, but we'll not talk about that, has been used, as I said earlier, as a means of disguising what's going on.
But the point I'm trying to make is, people, just to pick up Roger's point, people are moving, they're bored with that. So they're actually seeking out something that is more authentic and genuine. And then strangely, when it's presented on an international platform, bang, it goes to number one. I mean, we haven't got enough time to explore Outlander because of a bit of sex. I suspect a lot of people still have a kind of, I don't know about that. And obviously it'll mash various bits of Scottish history, but it clothes it, which, so much of our history is not clothed. It's series of details, dates. There's no feel for what actually happened. So any of this seems to me to be a kind of useful thing to just provoke questions.
Well, it's interesting. Alistair Gray talks about it in Lanark, in the conversation between Sludden and Lanark. And Sludden says that, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the quote in front of me, but to the effect that your city does not have any reality or significance if nobody's written about it. And that's the truth of the matter. If it's not written about, then it doesn't have any reality to anybody. If it's not filmed, it doesn't have any reality to anybody at all. I mean, I think what's interesting about YouTube is watching the number of reactors who are reacting to things like Still Game. And you think, Americans, do you even understand what you're listening to linguistically, never mind culturally, but the reactions are staggering. They get it. And they get all of these things. And I think that's the significance that as Scots, what we have is a very sort of special way of approaching things, which is and I think it has to do with this ability to have two ideas in your head at the same time. You can focus broadly on any topic, and I think it allows it's not a free for all. It doesn't mean that everything is acceptable or everything is in the pot, but what it does mean is in any particular topic, the range of that topic, because it's not confined, it's not limited, the range of that topic is possible. And I think you look at something, as I say, Still Game, I think is a staggeringly good example of it, is the fact that it's not described or portrayed as a working class sitcom. Whereas if it had been made south of the border, I suspect it most certainly would have been and marketed as such. Because it's not that at all, it's something else. It's just about how people live in a particular circumstance. And I think these things are interesting because they are the very things that talk to us about where we are, but they also talk to the world outside about who we are. And I think, to me, that's interesting. I think Department Q, which I've seen all of it, is interesting.
Right. Now, chaps, Stuart, I'm sorry. We've got to stop. Just for now, though I suspect, as I say, we'll be back on this one. Is there one final, which is really short thing you want to say there, Stuart?
Yeah. And this has cropped up an awful lot over the years. Burns, who's been translated into every written language on the planet. The whole world gets Burns. The only people that didn't get Burns are the English.
Well, let's leave it there. I'm always amused about, because with a name Riddoch, I do encounter a certain problem in pronunciation, and used to work south of the border. It happened constantly, and I would say to those people who are having difficulties, can you say the composer Bach? And strangely enough, everyone can say Bach because that's a cultured thing. And I said, right, Bach, Loch, Riddoch. And it would just peter out as we went through everything as it became more Scottish. So anyway, this is, I should say, I was born in Wolverhampton, so technically I am English. This is just an observation about the cultures that are grinding away, and ours, which is resurgent, which is great news and great to celebrate. So thank you to Roger and Stuart. The books that they've mentioned will be in the link to the podcast. Buy them, read them, and maybe we'll be back again.